Well, g'day everyone. Welcome to the podcast. This is Live from the Peloton. I'm Mitch Stocker, and our proud supporter this year is Rapha. If you saw my recent trip to Adelaide and you're wondering what I was wearing the Rapha limited edition Unknown Road collection. The jersey took inspiration from escaping the city and exploring dusty rural roads in the pursuit of a ride into the unknown. Exactly what we were doing on our trip from Ballarat across to Adelaide for the Tour Down Under. An awesome jersey, a great collection. Like I said, that's limited. Get across, check it out. I know I've got mine, so I'm okay. But you guys, if you're in a hurry, make sure you get across and check that one out. Right now, we've got the new episode for you. This week, I'm chatting with Dr. Gerche, the sports cardiologist at the Baker Institute here in Melbourne. Now, if you're a long-time listener, you would know that last February, I chatted with Andre as well, because we chatted about the UCI test that the pro cyclists have to undergo to be in the World Tour. The obligatory checks that we need to do to make sure our heart is up to the level of being a professional sportsman. Well, we just broke down what that actually means. And we looked into what might happen to my heart. Do I need a D-train? What's the road ahead looking like? Well, it's 12 months down the track, and I voluntarily took myself into the Baker Institute and went through a whole range of testing. I mean, I did DEXA scans, I did E.C.Gs, VO2 maxes, MRIs while trying to pedal some kind of, small mini bicycle in there. It was a full day of testing. And, of course, I took the mic with me to record it all and let you guys in on what is going on with me after 12 months as a pro athlete. But also I asked the questions about general health, cardiovascular health. What's going on with our hearts? Where do we need to go as normal human beings, day-to-day exercise, lifestyle choices that we've got to make? I think it's so interesting. And it was really good for me to be able to go in there and do those tests. Well, lucky in a way. You're going to find out in this episode where I'm sitting post-retiring. I'm talking about my cardiovascular system, my physical health. But one thing I'm trying to take more care about now is my overall health, my well-being. As a pro, it was all about performance, the elite stuff. And even though I was using athletic greens when I was racing, I feel like now when time is a bit more precious, it really is my go-to. I start every day with AG1, a small scoop mixed with water. I normally do ice water. I shake it up and I'm ready to go. Not only am I getting all my greens, vitamins, minerals, whole food source, superfoods, probiotics, but I'm immediately getting it first thing in the morning. It's just like the perfect way to start for me. I often have a quick coffee straight afterwards and hit the road for an early ride. It's the best way to ride first thing in the morning. Look, if a comprehensive solution is what you need from your supplement routine, the Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/lifeinthepeloton. That's athleticgreens.com/lifeinthepeloton. Check it out. I reckon you guys will really like it. Now, guys, sit back and enjoy this. If you can, you'll probably have a laugh listening to me suffer through these tests, but I think what you will most enjoy is when we read through the results. Of course, it's a bit of a laugh when I have to go through these tests, and it's pretty interesting, I think, to hear what it takes to go through these tests and to get this data. But the most interesting thing, as always, is talking to Andre because he speaks my language. He's easy to understand, and he gives me the lowdown about how I'm traveling. And that's the most important thing. I hope you enjoy it, guys, because I sort of did doing the tests, but I certainly enjoy seeing the results. Well, it's the 21st of December, right before Christmas, and I'm on my way down to Melbourne to the Baker Heart Institute, where I used to get my UCI testing done, the heart testing with Andre Gerche. And I'm down there to meet him again today and run through some testing. I'm actually a little bit nervous this morning. I've been fasting this morning. Well, it's only 7:30 in the morning now, so not too hard yet. But I'm going to go down there and run through a whole day of testing to find out what has been going on with me 12 months on since retiring as a pro. Yeah, like I said, just a little bit nervous actually, because VO2 max testing and DEXA scans and all this sort of stuff
those truths you don't want to find out, plus some pretty hard efforts along the way. We'll be reporting in throughout the day and listen to me huff and puff and find out what's going on. So, well, here we go. Well, Crystal Janssens, she's taken me into the first room. I've arrived here. Now we're going to run through what's going on today.
Thanks, Mitch. You're going to be part of a research study that Andre's conducting here at the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute. The testing you're going to undergo today, like the risks involved are very minimal, but I'm going to do a fasting blood test. We're going to look at some cardiac markers, cholesterol, but then we're also going to store a sample to look at your genetics. The genetics that we're going to look at only have to do with your heart, so just with heart function and size. We're not going to look at any other genes. Then you're going to undergo a fasting DEXA scan. That's to look at body composition and bone health. We're going to do a resting E.C.G, the electrocardiogram, which is usually part of screening anyway of athletes. Measure your blood pressure. You're going to undergo a VO2 max test. Then a heart ultrasound and the cardiac MRI. As part of the cardiac MRI, you're also going to be pedaling a supine bike at different workloads while lying into the scanner. We're going to inject some dye. It's a contrast that looks at any scarring in the heart muscle. And then one last thing is that you'll be wearing a 24-hour Holter monitor to record your heart rate or heart rhythm for 24 hours.
It's a lot there. Pretty special to be able to get this done because not everyone can do this, and to be able to have all this data on myself. I know before, when I was a professional, I didn't understand how special it was to be able to have all that recordings of myself.
I think it's quite special.
All right, let's get into it. First up, DEXA scan, then the E.C.G and some blood pressures.
So that's how it comes up, full body. In terms of composition, so it gives us your total mass, it gives the fat mass, and this machine, it's very accurate in detecting what is fat, also very accurate in detecting what is bone. This is fat mass, this is lean, this is bone mineral content.
10 kilograms of fat, is that what it's saying? No.
Yes, correct. Which is, in terms of percentage, you're at 13.9% of tissue fat. Lean body mass is everything. It's also your fluids, organs. So that really varies. Hence, we do it fasting on everyone. Because if you would drink 2 liters of fluid before coming in, that would add 2 kilos of lean body mass, basically, on this scan. If we really want to compare athletes and their kind of leanness, we intend to take the trunk out and just compare your arms and legs in terms of lean body mass, because it's organs, fluids. This machine, it's accurate in terms of detecting fat and bone mineral content. Lean mass, that can vary because it also includes your fluids and organs.
So nothing crazy good there, more just in normal range.
Normal range, nothing crazy good. But in general, with especially cyclists, we tend to see
the other way, don't we?
The other way.
Yeah, because we have bad bone density.
It's not a weight-bearing sport. All of you are very lean in terms of, eating enough and not being energy deficient. So we look at the bone density, and again, you're well within the normal range, which is good for an like a cyclist, because we see a lot of the guys in the osteopenic range even going to osteoporotic at a young age.
Yeah, right. And a normal person who hasn't been cycling their whole life would sit around where I am, you would expect.
Correct.
Yep.
Yes. I think Andre should chat to you about your ECG. What makes it good? You've got very nice R wave progression, and it just looks very normal, and you've got good voltages. Just looks very nice, and everything just looks
how it should be.
How it should be. Every wave that should be upright is upright, and every one that should be facing down is facing down, and the intervals between the different waves are all normal. So it's just a very nice looking ECG. It really is.
What can you see in the blood pressure now that you would be looking for? Is this just a general
high blood pressure? So we do two. So in general, your blood pressure will be measured at rest, like when you go and see your GP. And we kind of, it gives us the two values, the upper value, the systolic blood pressure, and the lower value is what we call the diastolic value. We want that to be below 140, the upper value, on 90. And then also we will measure your blood pressure during exercise. So your blood pressure is normal. It's kind of on the higher of normal, but normal, 132 on 66. We'll also measure your blood pressure throughout exercise, and your blood pressure goes up during exercise. And a lot of the endurance athletes, their blood pressure will go above what's considered normal in terms of blood pressure response during exercise, what they call an exaggerated blood pressure response to exercise. We think that's due to the cardiac output, or the big hearts and the flow of the blood coming through when you're pushing high watts on the bike, compared to arterial stiffness, which is the main cause for having hypertension. So we think it's not bad. We think, yes, those blood pressures are very high, but it's probably flow related during exercise. It's just the sheer flow of the blood coming through, rather than the kind of the tubes of your blood vessels being stiff.
Why would mine now be slightly higher, do you think, resting?
It's because, blood pressure is just so variable, and maybe just because we were talking, it might have just gone up.
Okay.
I'm going to take a second one. It's within the normal values. It's just like upper limits of normal at the moment.
Yeah.
So let's take another one.
All right, Andre, we're back here again, almost a year after we caught up last year. But you've got me in the lab testing. I'm not a pro anymore, as we well and truly know now, but we're going to run through a whole lot of testing, a bit of a lab rat today, aren't we?
Yeah, so we're very interested in the long-term sort of implications of doing... How many years were you
I was over there for 13, yeah.
13 years, plus all of the training leading up to that, so 15 plus years of really high intensity training and racing. So what does that do to the heart? And what does it do when you're racing? What does it do when you retire? You've got what, 70 good years of life left?
It feels like it's over already. Retired, I'm coming to the end. Actually, hang on, I'm just starting.
Exactly.
Well, I'm interested because actually, as we were talking on the way up to get a quick coffee this morning, we're sort of in the middle of the testing now. We've done a couple of tests already with Crystal, and now we're about to do the VO2. I've been fasting. It's like I need a tiny bit of energy before I go maximum on this ergo. And what you're telling me on the way up here is actually right back in the beginning. I'd forgotten about it. You got one of my very first, laboratory tests in about 2008. A bit more along, I think one or two when I was with GreenEdge, and then one right at the end of my career when I was with EF. So it's sort of a nice little, I'm assuming, a bit of data.
Yeah, fantastic data. Pretty unique to have that sort of imaging over a whole career, and to then get an idea now, I'd call it probably semi-retirement, because you're still doing a lot of training. But that also is the nature of there's not so many athletes that stop cold, so it'll be interesting to see what's happening. We've already got a bit of an idea that some of the changes that we see during really high training and competition tend to resolve. Some of the things like big pauses or gaps in the heart rhythm, whereas other things tend to sort of come out after retirement, like some of the faster heart rhythms become more common with the combination of years of training plus age.
So can you sit here and predict anything, what you might see from the results or anything like that? Because I've been doing 19 hours of training, typically when I was a pro, 33,000K a year. Now I've dropped it back to 11,000K, 9 hours of training. Look, it's anyone out there listening is, he's still training a lot, but what I've come from, it feels like I'm doing practically nothing. Would you see any difference, or it's not enough drop to really see a big enough change?
It'll be interesting. Some of the things we see, for example, in the general population, almost never see pauses or sort of stops in the heart rhythm for more than 2 seconds. In really highly trained athletes like yourself, we quite commonly, like around 20%, 1 in 5 people will see pauses, especially during sleep, and they probably don't mean much. And then about 4 or 5% we even see pauses longer than 3 seconds. And if we saw that in the general population, we'd sort of start thinking about pacemakers and things. Whereas in athletes, we just see it all the time. People are perfectly well. And interestingly, we've sort of recently learnt that in retirement, they disappear. So they're the in-training sort of changes. So we might, on your Holter monitor, see less pauses or just not see any. Whereas other things like atrial fibrillation, some of these common nuisance arrhythmias that tend to occur in the sort of 40s, 50s, 60s and become more common, we see those, it seems, we see those more in former athletes than the general population. So my suspicion in you is that we don't see anything too alarming on all the testing, but in years to come, they'd be the things that we'd look for as well.
Andre, before I'm geared up, I'm on the bike, we're about to do the VO2. I guess before I put the mask of death on, let's just run me through, what have I got to do today? What's the protocol?
So basically this is a ramp protocol. It just gets, after a little bit of a warm-up, it just gets harder and harder and harder until you fail. It's a really disconcerting test because normally you're aiming for a finish line, whereas this is a finish line that just gets further and further away until you pop. But what we do is measure the amount of oxygen that your body uses, and it increases with the amount of work you're doing to a point at which it then just can't increase anymore. We call that sort of the plateau. And in most well-trained athletes will clearly find the point at which your body just can't use any more oxygen even if you're trying.
So I only need to go to the plateau. I don't need to keep going on the plateau, do I?
You don't, but to be honest, the time of the plateau is pretty short.
Yeah,
so
right.
what we do is just encourage you to give everything.
Yeah, I bet you do.
And then often it's interesting in athletes, often they actually go past the plateau and the oxygen use actually drops off a bit. It's quite phenomenal. So the whole concept that people are, that your body is using less energy to do more, but that lasts for a very short period of time.
That's weird, isn't it? Put the mask on, which is going to take my oxygen, and then you can keep talking me through what's going on.
Yep, beautiful. We've got the support of Amy, Crystal and Ash here to push you along, provide encouragement. They can be like the crowd on the side of the Alpe d'Huez.
And so we're going to make this fairly tight so that we've got an airtight seal.
Okay.
Yeah, you could sort of cheat around the snorkel
Feel free
a
to
bit.
move it around. And then we've just got a really scientific test to check for any air leaks. So if you breathe out towards my hand, I'm going to plug the hole and we'll listen for any air leaks. So breathe out. Beautiful. So we are starting with that lung function test. So what I'll get you to do is stop pedaling so that it's nice and rested. Sit up tall so that we can get the most out of your lungs. So what this is going to tell us, it's going to tell us about your lung volume, so your vital capacity, and how well you can expel that air. And basically you can see the maximum amount of litres per second that you can push out.
Okay.
To do that, in a moment I'm going to pop the flow sensor into the end of the mask, and then I'm going to give you some breathing instructions to follow. I want you to do them all breathing through your mouth, not through your nose. So first up, it'll be nice, relaxed breathing, just like you are now. Then I'll tell you to exhale all the way. So without taking a big deep breath in first, I just want you to breathe all the way out until I say. So keep going. Then I'll say take a big deep breath in, really fill up the lungs as much as you possibly can. And then I'll say hard out. From the diaphragm, give me a big as hard as you possibly can, and then keep breathing out to assess. So nice, normal breathing. Alright, Mitch, on the next one, breathe out all the way, nice and slow. That's it. So keep breathing out until you fully empty the lungs. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Almost there. And big breath in, fill it up. Good. And then hard out. Good. That's it. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Almost there. Go, 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 go. And done. So we can see on this axis here, that's your lung volume. The computer has a prediction for a male of your stature usually, and it would say about 5.4 litres, but you just did 7.13, so really nice. And then when we look at the flow, or how quickly you can expel the air, again, it was predicting around 10, and you're up at over 11.
Right.
Very nice.
Yeah, in theory, athletes don't have any bigger lung volumes, but it probably, in truth, the whole engine is heart and lungs, and so bigger lungs are definitely an advantage.
So, in theory, athletes should all have the same size lungs. Is that what you're saying?
Not the same, because it depends on body size, it depends on lots of things, but if we take athletes and non-athletes, athletes clearly have bigger hearts, whereas the lungs are a similar size. Yeah. But then having said that, if you're a big barrel-chested unit with big lungs and more room for your heart, that's an advantage. So they're nice reproducible tests, they're almost photocopies of the same thing. So what that does is one of the reasons for doing this is partly as a bit of a screen for things like asthma, but the other is if we know the maximum amount of air that you can move in and out of your lungs, during exercise you shouldn't actually ever get there. Yeah. So you should be breathing hard and you approach that, but you approach that late in exercise and it's never as much as you're just trying to take the biggest breath that you can.
Is this something that you would predict to see drop away as an athlete retires? You know, is this something that as a peak athlete gets in their prime, you're going to see the best functioning lung and the most amount of oxygen intake and using the lungs to their maximum ability, but as I retire, as I stop using it and the need for it, am I then going to just suddenly, you know, come back in 5 years' time and the body's just like, well, you don't need to suck in 7 litres anymore?
Yeah, we do see that a little bit with heart function and definitely the overall heart and lung function, the VO2 does definitely fall away. The lung measures that we do seem to stay more stable.
Okay.
So this time you can breathe however comes naturally.
So now we're just putting in the turbine. What that does is these little tubes tell us the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the gas that you breathe out, and there's a little sort of turbine like a jet engine in the end of it that tells us how much volume of gas comes out, and that so by knowing the volume of gas, the amount of air that you're breathing, and the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide, then we can work out how much goes in, how much comes out, and therefore how much the body's using and producing. Oxygen consumption is what the whole test is about, and that's because when we exercise, the body uses oxygen as its dominant fuel, and as a consequence of that, we produce carbon dioxide.
So blood pressure cuff is going to inflate now, Mitch, and we're just going to collect 2 minutes of resting data, and then we'll let you know when we want you to start cycling.
Right.
3, 2, 1, and you can start.
It's really useful for us because if you do stages where it's at one area, then you don't work out exactly which wattage people fail.
Yeah.
So when we're comparing different individuals, this is sort of easier data for us to use.
Plus it's better because it's only 13 minutes.
Yeah, correct.
Is there a preferred cadence I should sit at, or just whatever?
It's up to you. Whatever feels most natural. What happens is the faster you cadence, the less watts. The faster you cadence, the lower the resistance, so that the wattage is constant. So you can either push harder less frequently or push what we do is set the actual work power requirements. So to give you an idea, at the moment you're doing about 70 watts, and which should be very, very easy, and all of the measures here would suggest that it's very easy. Your oxygen went up when you started exercising, but is now sort of plateauing and is at a pretty low level. And to give you an idea, your VO2, your oxygen consumption at the moment is 23 mil per minute per kilogram, which is already more than what we measure in some of our patients with heart conditions.
Really? When they're doing a test?
Yep, so some patients with heart failure or with a weak heart, they will only be able to, at their very maximum of exercise, have a VO2 of 10 to 14 mil per minute per kilogram. So you're already double that and you haven't really started working.
Says you.
Yeah.
Yes, please. Fans going on. Let's get serious.
And we'd be expecting for a male of your age a VO2 of about 38 mil per minute per kilogram on average. Obviously, as an athlete of your calibre, we'd be expecting substantially more than that. Males naturally have a higher VO2 than women, which is for the same age and amount of training, and that's probably in part related to differences in body composition.
Right.
More lean mass to fat in males, and also it does seem that even at the cellular level that the oxygen utilisation or the work of the mitochondria in metabolising oxygen is a bit more efficient in males. Having said that, we get a lot of our female athletes have superb oxygen uptake. Interestingly as well, and we often see this in elite athletes, your heart rate at the moment is 135, and relative to how much oxygen you're producing, it's sort of low. A lot of your ability to produce oxygen is from a lower heart rate with the heart pushing bigger volumes. And that again is sort of part of the elite athlete signature.
Is there anything in that I'm not in a heavy training load like I normally would be when I come to do these tests?
So we tend to find if you're in a really heavy training load, firstly it would take a little bit off your VO2. You get your highest result if you're a bit fresher, but one of the things we see is a sort of blunting of that heart rate response. So at any given VO2, your heart rate's a little bit lower when you're more fatigued. This element of the test where it's hard but still physiologically comfortable, that's the most important bit. Your VO2 is now about 55 mil per minute per kilogram, so it's sort of getting towards twice as fit as the average person, and you're still below the sort of hurt zone, if you like. Everything's, the body switches from using oxygen to meet all of the work needs, which is what it's doing at the moment, and then it gets to a point where oxygen is unable to meet all of the metabolic needs, and that's when the muscles start to produce acid, and they actually use that acid as part of the energy after that. But at the moment it's all aerobic or all oxygen. It's starting to transition about now at about 350 watts. You are definitely in the zone now where the body's producing a bit of acid, makes the breathing harder. So keep it up, doing really well. 420 plus watts. Really good. Oxygen use is starting to plateau, but we're just getting towards 70 mil per minute per kilogram. A bit more to go.
That's it. Every little bit
Great
counts
work.
here.
How many watts?
495.
496.
Well done.
You probably are.
It's probably over 500 because it averages, so you've got over 500 watts.
Well done. Excellent work.
Brilliant work. We'll show you in a second, but
So straight away you can already see 1 year later, okay, I wouldn't have the endurance to do back-to-back stage races or maybe a long classics race, but the level is still, hasn't really dropped away in 12 months.
your level of fitness is still elite. Like you had a VO2 over 70, very high numbers at ventilatory threshold. I suspect that if we measured this 5-10 years ago, your numbers would have been higher.
Yeah.
And you probably know that from racing. It'd be hard for you to jump into some of the races that you were doing, but it's still elite compared to most people that we measure.
Be interesting to see now what's actually happened with the heart, but from what you're saying now, it can be very difficult for you to see any change in 12 months.
Yeah, so I mean this is your heart rate. See this sort of thatched area here? That's where a normal heart rate increase is during exercise. Yours tracked along normally, but about 10, 20 beats lower than what the average person would. But then got to the really very much to your predicted heart rate.
Which was what?
Which was about 184.
Yeah, right.
And so all that tells us is that for any amount of oxygen the body needs, your heart rate only needs to be lower because you're pumping a lot of blood with every heartbeat. And that's absolutely classical for what we see of endurance athletes. There's a lot of variation. Some people, get that oxygen consumption by beating faster with less volume. But yours is about, the sort of stereotypical or average of an elite endurance athlete.
Leah, we're in the next room. What are we doing here?
So what we're going to do today is take some ultrasound pictures of your heart. So what that looks at is the size and the pump function of the heart, how the valves are working, and we can also get an idea of the internal pressures inside the heart as well. So the kind of how all the plumbing is working essentially.
What do I have to do? Lie down, just relax?
Exactly. So lying on your left-hand side, a bit of deep breathing. So nothing too complicated after the VO2, a nice relaxing time.
Let's do it. What have you seen so far, or can you not see anything really until you get the results?
Well, at the moment, we're generally pretty poker face when we do this, but at the moment your heart looks like you're someone who's done a lot of exercise in the past, which is what we'd expect. So if I say, average person came into the ultrasound room and I put the probe on and I saw that they had quite significant increase in the volume of their heart in all the chambers, I would first up probably start asking them, so what exercise do you do in the past? Especially if there's someone who's a bit, looks like they've done a bit of exercise. If someone came in and you knew they had heart failure or etc. and couldn't lie flat on a bed, that's a different thing. But if someone prances into the room and they've ridden their bike here from somewhere, I'd start giving them a bit of a question of what their exercise routine usually is, because it can help us to contextualise what the changes are and if they're kind of relative to the amount of exercise someone's doing.
So if you can't talk to someone like that, or you can't see them and you just have to study it like an exam per se, is there ways to see that differentiate between, say, a sportsman and someone who's maybe got problems?
Yeah. So there's a few extra things we look at. So we look at the kind of remodeling in proportion to all the chambers. So so we've got 4 main chambers in the heart. If one significantly increased more than the others, that might be kind of a bit of a highlight that actually maybe there's something else going on here. Often in athletes, especially the endurance athletes, we see a somewhat kind of balanced increase in all the chambers to each other. So that can kind of tell. And then also depending on the exercise that someone's doing, if someone's doing more kind of endurance or kind of rowing often as well, we might see some more right-sided increases as well, and strength training, we can see different increases in that as well. But we kind of look at, and often if we want to see athletes' hearts sometimes look like they're half asleep.
Really?
They're can be so efficient at pumping at rest that, like any muscle, it doesn't need to do that much to meet your body's oxygen demand. And that's why we do so much of our testing is focused on that exercise component. As soon as you put, in that MRI and you're cycling or you're on the VO2, we see that's when the heart really comes into its own. So that's why often if we're thinking there might be a problem with an athlete, we look at them at rest, but then we also do a lot of that exercise imaging to see what's really happening when that heart needs to give the body its requirements.
All right, we've just done the echo, got a bit of time. I'm back with Crystal. Now, what have we got coming up next?
So up next is the cardiac MRI. There's two parts to the MRI you're going to undergo. There's a normal cardiac MRI. We are going to inject some dye. That was going to look at any scarring in the heart muscle. But we also going to get you to exercise while lying in the MRI scanner.
That's inject dye into me, into my body.
Yes, so we're going to inject dye into you, into your body. It's not going to... It doesn't have any colour, but yes, it lights up any areas of scarring within the heart muscle, which at the end, when Andre goes through your results, he'll be able to see. Then there is the exercise part where you will be clipped into a bike that's mounted on the end of the MRI bed. It's a very small crank because you'll need to be able to pedal while in the tunnel of the MRI. So we need to give you enough room so you don't bump your knees against the roof of the scanner, but then also have enough room to not get caught up with your heel on the bed while you're pedaling around. So it's a tiny little crank which you'll have to pedal very fast to manage the workloads.
It's like a clown bike. That's like being on a unicycle, is it?
Correct. And so it's quite hard. You'll feel like you're using your hamstrings, your calves. It's not like being on the upright bike at all. The maximum watts that you can do on the supine bike that this bike can do is 300 watts, which you'll be doing at your high level exercise in the MRI. So once you push 500 watts on the upright bike, we measure 20, 40 and 60% for the workloads on the supine bike. But that means that you'll be pushing 100 watts, 200 watts and 300 watts in the MRI scanner.
Did myself a disfavour by doing a high amount of watts
Correct.
Just now.
Yes, the higher amount of watts you put on the upright bike, the higher amount of watts you have to push in the MRI scanner, yes. That's why we leave that fun bit for last.
So what are we going to see in this scan? Why do we do this with exercise?
Because a lot of conditions, when you're just looking at the heart at rest, it'll look completely normal. But then as soon as you start exercising it, that just shows a lot of things that kind of might not function all that well. So it's just making the heart to work a little bit and then image it and see that everything is functioning as we'd expect it should be.
Oh, all right, I've just come out of the MRI. It was pretty relaxing for some of it until we had to ride this mini bicycle. And to be honest, I thought I had it the first minute or two, and then you got no perception of how long you're going to be doing this thing for. Even though you know you're doing it for 9 minutes or whatever it is, you don't know, and it just feels like forever. Just waiting for that voice to come in on the headphones. It was an interesting experience, to say the least. Right, just before we leave, it's not over yet. I've got 24 hours left. I've just got wired up. Crystal, what have you given me for the night?
So it's a 24-hour Holter monitor. It's like 24 hours of continuous E.C.G monitoring. So it's going to look at your electrical activity of the heart during that time, daytime, nighttime, look at any irregularities in your heart rate, how low it gets at night, also what it averages out over the day. So mainly looking at any arrhythmias over the next 24, any irregularities over the next 24 hours.
And it doesn't matter if I go running or riding or do nothing, that's just what you want to see?
Yes, you can exercise with it. Some people like to do a big effort with it to see what their maximum heart rate can be out in the field compared to what they've done on the VO2 max test. But you can just exercise as per normal, and then we can look at what the heart rate got up to. We're definitely interested at night, how low the heart rate gets, and then it averages it over 24 hours, gives us good information.
All right, Andre, we're back 2 days later. We're sitting in your office here. My results are in. I guess the first question is, let's just talk about before we did this test. What did you expect to see in these results from this test, from me being out of the World Tour for a year?
I think I expected to see a very high level of fitness because it is interesting. You obviously have kept riding, perhaps not to the same high levels of training and competition, but still I was expecting to see an elite professional degree of fitness, which is what we saw on the VO2. And then what we always see with that is a big, well-functioning heart.
Now, what have we seen? Let's have a look at let's get into some of the results. And you're going to go through a couple of these things here. We've got the echo, we've got the VO2, we've also got the MRI as well, which is interesting. I'm going to let you take it away. Let's run through some of these results and you can sort of explain to me what we've got here.
Yep. So we put you through, the full gamut of tests. And this is one of the simpler tests that we do to look at heart size and function, which is called an echocardiogram, which is an ultrasound of the heart. So you can see your heart here beating away with the valves opening and closing. And immediately when I see this, I can see that it's a large heart. We can see that when we measure some fairly simple measures, one called ejection fraction, which is how much blood the heart pumps out relative to its size. In the athlete population, we often see ejection fractions that are quite low because the heart's pumping out, it's pumping out an amount, but the heart's really big. So as a ratio, we often see ejection fractions of around 50-55%. Yours is actually sort of quite high for an athlete. It doesn't mean so much, but your ejection fraction is 61%, which would be bang smack in the normal range for a normal person. In athletes, and if anyone has this test who's an endurance athlete, don't be alarmed if your ejection fraction's 50-55%. It's just simply part of the athlete's heart sort of spectrum with a big heart. But your heart's functioning perfectly normally. All of the measures, we've got a thing called global longitudinal strain here, which is the degree to which the heart sort of shortens or contracts. And we regard negative 18% as normal. Yours is exactly on that, negative 18%.
Perfect.
But again, like the other measures, we often see low values in the athletes because when the heart's just lying there at rest, it actually doesn't have to work that hard. I often say that the athlete's heart, it's almost like it's hibernating. One of the things the body always does is it's kind of lazy in a way. The body doesn't use any more energy than it has to. And because your heart, as we'll show on the MRI scan, because your heart's pumping about 160 mils per heartbeat, to get the amount of blood flow that the organs need when you're just sitting there, it hardly has to pump. So it doesn't contract very hard and it beats very slowly to get the same amount of blood.
Does that mean, obviously it means we've got a lower resting heart rate. When we're relaxed, it doesn't need to beat as fast. Does that mean we've got a lower peak heart rate, max heart rate? Because technically, well, maybe not technically, because we're going harder, we're trying to get more out of our own body. Does it mean it's lower at the top?
So it's a fascinating question, and the answer is yes. So on average, highly trained endurance athletes have a lower peak heart rate than non-athletes. And to me, for ages, I just thought, how on earth can that be? Because, the way that you pump more blood during exercise, the main way you pump more blood is to pump more quickly. What happens in endurance athletes is there's a little bit of a sacrifice of that top output so that your heart can pump more blood at a lower heart rate when you're racing at about 60-70%. So it's almost like endurance athletes train themselves to be most efficient when they're at their threshold, when they're at 70-80% of their maximum, and they lose that top 95 to 100% by, the heart gets bigger and pumps less frequently. Then when you're going at really maximum exercise, because the heart's so big, it's actually hard for the heart to fill. And so you get a reduction in the maximum heart rate. And then during things like the tour, all of you and all of your mates would have found that your heart rate in the third week is lower than it was in the first week. And I think that's a bit of a reflection that the heart's becoming a little bit fatigued and having difficulties filling.
Is there any obvious signs of people's size of their heart by their, say, max heart rate? So, for instance, Caleb Ewan, I know, used to have, well, he probably still does, when we were racing, he'd be at 220, heart rate, when I'm at 180. Like, still a hard point, but he'd be just that much higher than me. I'm like, why is that? Does he have a really small heart that needs to do that? Or he just has a better functioning heart?
Maybe a little bit of both. I've looked at Caleb's heart in the past, and I can't exactly remember the answer to the size relative to everyone else's, but one of the differences will be the training style, because he is the sort of cyclist versus a domestique who needs that top 5%. If he trained, up the hills every day, he probably could become more of it's a funny thing to say, because obviously all Tour de France are endurance, but I reckon he could lose some of his speed and get better at climbing mountains long, which is not what he wants. Mm-hmm. So I think to a degree that maximum heart rate is both his physiology, and that's what's made him a great sprinter, but I also think that his training probably then plays into that so that he maintains it.
So you're not necessarily looking at, say, heart rate values and going, I can predict what sort of heart I'm looking at?
Not really, but it is interesting how often they all go together. Okay. So, you're really out and out domestique. Like, for example, your physiology on the VO2 max, we were all saying that you were just going, and it looked like we were going to be there all day. Then you hit your ventilatory threshold and the test was almost over.
Yeah.
There really wasn't much in there. And that's the signature of a sort of domestique, the sort of person that can go all day, where your level at threshold is superb, but then your ability in the, say, 2 kilometre time trial at the end of a long stage wouldn't be the same as a Caleb or some of these people that have more room in that top level. In that top, it's not always correct. There's a lot of different things, and there's psychology, and there's efficiencies, there's skills, but it is interesting how much the physiology that we see on the screen often fits with the type of sort of puncher or more domestique, the climber. You do get a real sense of that from the physiology.
Well, let's have a look now at what's this next one we've got?
So this is the MRI scan, and the MRI is one of our favourite things because it just so beautifully shows the heart, shows all of the little sort of trabeculations or muscle strands. Just everything's very, very clear. And we can measure the volumes extremely accurately. And so the point here is, your heart is 260 mil in the left ventricle. So the heart has 4 chambers, and your left ventricle is 260 mil. Your right ventricle is 261 mil. Interestingly, that they're similar, because often we see the right ventricle being a bit bigger. That's just, some people have big noses, big ears, whatever. It's a personal characteristic rather than anything too significant. But you put those two together and then the atria, and that's about all up a 450, 500 mil. That's half a litre pump. It's a massive thing to be fitting in your chest. I was saying, to make some sort of comparison, we pulled up one of our non-athletic subjects.
Let's have a look at that.
So we won't use the subject's name, but this is a person with a VO2 who's 35 years of age, who has a VO2 of 32 mil per minute per kilogram. So a little bit under half. Yours was 72, bit under half. And we find that there's a really strong relationship between heart size and VO2. So I would be expecting that this person's heart is about half the size of yours. And so if we just calculate the volumes of the heart, and you can immediately see that there's more lungs, there's more room in the chest. The heart, instead of being a sort of half a litre pump, is now sort of about the size of a can of Coke. And his end diastolic volume, yours was 260, his is 147 mil. You were pumping 160 mils with every heartbeat, he's pumping 85. So, in rough terms, he's half as fit and his heart is half the size. He's a little bit more than half as fit and a little bit bigger heart than half, but it's pretty close.
It's just funny, like when you run these tests, these other people you have in here who aren't athletes, they're just normal people. We're not extraordinary anyway, but do you know what I mean? They're still running through the test for about whatever it is, 10, 13 minutes or whatever, and they're just fatiguing the same. So visually, you wouldn't know any different, would you? Like, it still looked the same as me on the bike, didn't it?
If you didn't look at the numbers, the wattage, the output and things, they look very much the same. I mean, our controls work really hard. I think sometimes with the endurance athletes, it's very clear that you're used to burying yourselves. And so you see almost always that people reach their plateau or maximum and even go a bit beyond. But we see that the controls work really hard. The difference is that their output at ventilatory threshold is often a lot lower, and their maximum is also lower. If we put, and we've done this before just to demonstrate, if we sat average Joe next to you on a bike with exactly the same protocol, it's actually quite fascinating, because the person who is starting to get toward maximum with their exercise, and you'd just be sitting there like you're not even trying.
That's what I found so funny the other day when you were telling me, all right, we're at 38. This is when most average shows are finishing. I was like I wasn't saying I was just like cruising, but it was pretty beginning. It didn't quite actually settled into me. I was like, that doesn't really feel right. Like, how can I be that far ahead of someone?
And remember that our controls here are pretty average. So if you get people below average, I often say that, if you think about VO2 max, the range in a 35-year-old, if it's getting much under about 25, then the people are generally pretty sick. But you would get a range from 25 up to, say, 75 mil per minute. So that's a threefold difference in fitness. You try to think about that with any other characteristic. If we had that in height, that would be like a Oompa Loompa walking down the street next to some 3 meter tall person. We just don't see those differences. And fitness is an extraordinarily flexible trait. You can be like yourself, unbelievably fit. And then there's other people going around today who will be short of breath, walking out of the train station.
What about at the top end, in the World Tour, let's say, that difference is there, because there's clearly guys at the very pointy end of it, the Walt Van Aerts, the Van der Poels, the Pitcocks of the world at the moment.
Yep.
Are we expecting, if we were sitting on the trainer together, what sort of, I know you probably have an idea of what the top end VO2s are. What's the difference between, say, me, a 72, and like someone in the top end? Like, how far away am I seeing from the top end when it comes to physiology?
I reckon you're pretty close. I mean, our experience and what I've heard about on the sort of world tour, I remember someone telling me that at Cervelo they used to get cyclists in, and if their VO2 was under 75, they'd tell them that they, to come back, they weren't interested. I'm not sure that
I'm in trouble.
Yeah, I'm not. Well, I mean, I suspect yours was probably 2 or 3 mil high, but you're probably in your career sitting around that 75 mark. There will be some really elite cyclists below 75, but there won't be many. Most of the guys we measure in the tour are 75 or over.
What's over? 80, 85?
Yeah, the highest we've measured is in the low 80s. I can't remember exactly, 82, 84. There are reports in the literature of people in the high 80s and 90. The really interesting thing, though, is once you get beyond a dotted line, let's say the 75, it's not like you'll get the winner of the tour and they've got the best VO2.
Yeah, okay.
There's a whole lot of really interesting things, and probably one of the strongest predictors, your efficiency and speed or output at your ventilatory threshold. So if you can push, say 400 watts or something at your ventilatory threshold, so that's what you can push when you're riding up the hills, then that's the advantage rather than what your really top output is.
If you're a good tester, say.
Yeah. It's interesting. And the same is true of the heart, is that I could measure all of these hearts, and there's some people who have a small heart, and I would say pretty confidently they're never going to be an elite athlete. They're never going to be top of the patch. But above a certain dotted line, it's not like the biggest heart is the best athlete. If I was to measure the whole of the Tour de France, there would be a mix of heart sizes. They'd all be big. And actually we know this because from our data and from others, they're all big hearts. But the winner doesn't necessarily have the biggest heart.
Is there somewhere in the world, in a country, where they've gone to the extreme of testing young children, I guess, or teenagers to find out, okay, I know there's this athlete identification, but that's just like jumping over stuff or running down a 100 meters stretch and seeing if you're fast or not.
Yep.
Has a country taken to the extreme of actually doing lab testing and going, you're good, you're not good?
I think they have. It's a little bit obscured in myth and rumour, but certainly some of the Eastern Bloc countries a few decades ago, and there's been some pretty heavy talent identification in kids that has been done in China, for example. I'm not sure how educated sometimes those have been. I think what would be the most useful thing as a talent identification would be to put a whole bunch of, almost have a two-stage process. Take people that you think might be good, train them for 3-6 months, and then test them. Because if you give people a training stimulus, the really great athletes will react to that pretty quickly in terms of improving their fitness, and we will see changes in heart size, etc. Because when we've measured 15 and 16-year-old athletes coming through our program, their hearts are already very big.
What do you think has changed for me, if anything? Probably, has anything sort of changed for me? Do you think, like, am I actually healthier now? Am I actually in my optimum? Because I've had some time to let things soak up, because, like, clearly, okay, my VO2 max is maybe 2 or 3 points down, but I really did feel like I was going to be things on here you could have seen. My diet this year, I used to eat for performance.
Yep.
I'd fuel myself properly to train. I'm not saying I eat junk food now, but I just eat to live. If I get up and I miss breakfast, or if I have a crumpet and make my way and have a coffee or whatever, I'm not eating cleanly anymore. And of course, my alcohol consumption's gone up.
Yep.
Is any of this stuff evident in what you're seeing here?
Not really. I mean, I think, for example, your percentage body fat on the DEXA, I think, was 10, 11%.
13.
13%.
I wish it was 10,
Always shocks athletes how it seems like 13% would be a whole lot. That's actually very lean. But I suspect, again, when you were racing, it was probably in the 7-8 range. We rarely see under that. But so it's like the 2%ers between now and racing can make quite a difference in terms of performance. But in terms of health, it's probably healthier where you are now. Not saying that it was unhealthy then, but as a competitive athlete, you've always got to sort of be against the dotted line. You're really pushing the boundaries in terms of recovery. What we call, a normal training stimulus includes some overreaching, meaning that you're deliberately pushing yourself into fatigue to get better training benefits. Sometimes that becomes overtraining, which can be a bit unhelpful and even unhealthy. You're pushing that boundary. Whereas now you don't need to push that boundary, and you'd be sitting quite safely behind, the real edge. And this is, every test we've done here is uber healthy. You've got an extraordinary capacity. Your heart looks good in terms of its function. It's big, but that is a good thing. Your capacity and your heart size and things, if you maintain a reasonable level through life, at the age of 70, 80, you'll still have a VO2 of 40 mil or 35 mil. So you will be fitter than this guy who we have on the screen at the age of 35. So what he's able to do, jump on his bike and ride to wherever, up a few gentle hills, you'll be able to do that at 75, 80 years of age. And we see that. We've got a bunch of, older athletes, and it really is kind of training for life, because in their 70s and 80s, they have a level of function that matches that of the average Australian 30-year-old. And that's what I want to have. That's what I want to aspire to. I'm not so interested in living, everyone says, do athletes live till they're 110? No, it's not a big difference in terms of how long they live. But I tell you, if I line up my 75, 80-year-old athletes and they sit in the waiting room next to the average, they are like a different species.
You can see it visually.
You can absolutely see it. And then even more so, if they go for a walk up the hill with their mates, everyone can see who the professional cyclist was when they were 30, 40 years of age.
Well, tell me then, what about everyone out there listening now, who haven't been a pro athlete, or maybe haven't even really done that much sport in their life until now, or maybe want to do more now, getting on a bike and, doing all the gravel events out there? They're probably thinking, well, I'm doomed actually. I don't have that, VO2 of 70.
Yep.
My heart can't grow now because I've missed that period that we talked about when you were younger, it's grown or whatever.
Yep.
What's the takeaway point here? Can you actually do something about it?
the answer is yes. You can always improve your fitness, and with an improvement in fitness comes a reduction in heart attack risk, stroke risk, risk of diabetes, risk of a whole lot of cancers. So there's never a point at which you're sort of too old or too unfit to get more fit. Everyone will benefit. Now, having said that, the biggest bang for the buck is before the age of 60. If you've not exercised and you're over the age of 60, you definitely should, and you can get benefits, but the heart loses some of its plasticity. So if you really want to be super fit, you need to be thinking about, middle age or younger.
And will the heart grow?
It will. So that's at least up until the age of 60. If we put people through a training program of a few months or longer, we see the heart grow. If you're over the age of 60, then we see less of that. It's a bit like going and doing yoga. If you're young or middle-aged, you get more flexible. There comes an age where it's really hard to get that flexibility. I sort of see the same in the heart, is that if you're young or middle-aged, you can really see the heart getting bigger and smaller with fitness, whereas beyond about the age of 60, the changes we see are more modest.
Is there like a bang for your buck exercise, not bang for your buck, but the right exercise? There's this talk of, getting the gym for that bone density.
Yep.
That was something that we interestingly found out about my bone density. It was looking quite good comparative to cyclists, because cyclists have bad bone density. Or is it about doing endurance sports, because that's going to really work your cardio system? I don't know. People out there go, I've only got time to do one thing.
So from a health perspective, if we put sporting goals aside and just say from a health perspective, I often tell people that you should think about exercise a bit like a diet and have a bit of everything on the plate. So you want a little bit of low intensity aerobic, whether that's walking, going for a gentle ride or a jog, things like that take longer but are not too intense. And then you want a short, small amount of high intensity exercise training, so something that really gets you breathing. And that can be a minute, 2 minutes, do it a few times, like, for example, jogging up a hill or doing some sprints on the ergo, but things that really, where you're going so hard you couldn't have a conversation, but just for a few minutes and relaxing and recovering completely. So that gives you really good fitness, a combination of that. So low intensity and then short, high intensity, HIIT kind of training. And then the other thing I'd say for a good mix on the plate is some strength training. And I think that becomes really important, not just for partly bone density, physical capacity, but things like balance and injury prevention. It's really, I think often as endurance athletes skimp a little bit on the strength. And I think that three combination is perfect.
I'm listening to this, and it's very easy for me to say, because I love exercise. It's part of my life. It's part of me. I just feel crap and mentally crap if I don't go out and do something. But it also angers me, I guess it's not the right word, when I hear this, I've just got no time. I can't make time for it, because it's like when I'm listening to all this, it's quality of life. It's something that's really, really important for that, for quality of life later in your life. When you hear that, I guess you probably hear that I just don't have time, or I don't know, what's your approach to that? Is it about trying to find something that people enjoy doing? Because I think a lot of people, like we said before, it is easy for me because when I do it, it's easier for me to get better and better because of my physiology.
Well, I think you raised a whole lot of things that are really important there. One's enjoyment, because even though I just said you need to have three things on your plate, reality is people will do exercise they enjoy doing. So whilst you can have that as a broad principle, if you enjoy a particular sport, then that's really key. And then you can think about adding different bits in. The other thing in terms of time management, I think there's two aspects. One is to find some exercise where it is manageable for your lifestyle. Be realistic. Don't think if I've only got a little bit of time, I'm suddenly going to take up ultra endurance trail running. I'd be realistic about what time you have so that it's something that can be sustained. The other is, I think as a society, we often just don't even give it priority that it should. And I think that starts in school. In school, kids should be taught at school physical activity is as important as some of the other things that they're learning. And we're probably better at that in Australia than some other countries, because I know in some countries in Europe, for example, school sport isn't sort of compulsory or part of the program. It's good that we have some, But I'm not sure that kids are really taught these days just how important, because it's something that is going to be with you for life. I'm not sure how many people remember trigonometry when they're 75, whereas, if they're still able to walk up the stairs and things, it's absolutely key. It's key for enjoyment, health, and capacity later in life. I think it's really got to be sort of prioritised in our everyday education.
It might be an obvious question, but an active lifestyle, my mum's a very busy woman. She's at home. She's just taking care of the family. Even I'm noticing it now. Maybe that's why I've been able to keep some of those beers off the tummy, is that whenever I'm not out exercising, I'm just busy at home with the kids and stuff. Is that also a contributor, or does it needs to be actually physical where you're really out doing a run or something?
It's definitely a contributor, but it's interesting. I reckon the two things are almost inseparable, because fit people do a lot. And so, is it that they're doing a lot that makes them fit? I think it's absolutely part of the fact that your capacity at 72 means that you can do more in the day.
And
just do a lot more, because let's, for example, say this person whose heart we're looking at with a VO2 of 30, if they walk up 4 flights of stairs out of the station, they've pretty much hit their maximum, and it's taken 4 or 5 minutes. You in your week will hit your maximum probably about once on some really hard. All of your activities of life are so well within your comfort zone that you can do a lot more and not get fatigued. So you've got this enormous reserve where by playing with the kids and stuff is just a piece of cake. Whereas other people get exhausted because they're at their limit multiple times during a day.
So you'd be less judgmental actually about some people.
It does become, it becomes a vicious circle. If people don't prioritise their fitness, then fatigue, can sort of set in because of how much work they have to do.
What are some red flags then? People out there who may have, haven't really been good to themselves, or who knows, maybe they have been. What are some red flags we should be worrying about? Because look, my wife and I know some other people, sometimes experience, oh, geez, what was that pain in my chest? Geez, that was tight pain. Is that something to worry about? And, and it goes away in a second. Someone out there's experienced something else. What's something where you go, that's actually a red flag. You need to go and get yourself checked.
It's a good question. It's hard to give specifics for everything, but I think it really is important, because we often talk in these things about screening, like going and get tests done to see if a problem might develop. And all of the tests we have to look into the future are not great. Whereas if someone has a symptom, it's a really good time to evaluate, because we can sort of often, probably more often than not, we do the test and we're able to say, that's not the heart, you're fine. That also is therapeutic, because if the person's worried, they need to have that worry removed. But if the things that I would definitely be getting onto the phone to your doctor very quickly about is any chest pain, or in fact, we often say any pain above the belly button, particularly if it comes on when doing some work. If if you are walking up the stairs and you get a funny pressure in the chest, that even if it happens once is enough to call your doctor. The really sharp pains that last 1 or 2 seconds, they're almost never related to the heart. So
what are they?
It's common to get these muscle spasms, probably. The chest, it's frustrating because the heart's in the middle of the chest, and yet the chest is about the most complex sort of mechanical structure of the body. So you've got all these ribs and muscles going in different directions. So it's quite common to get these kind of like almost breathtaking sort of, what's that? And then it's gone.
Yeah.
And those, they're common, they're not related to the heart, and you don't need to worry about those. But pain that comes on, often a bit more gradually, often felt as a heaviness, but can be different, but almost always heart pain will last a minute or more.
And like you said, these were when we were like cutting up vegetables and things like that. It's not necessarily when I was exercising.
Yeah, more exactly. Sitting on the train, get this funny pang and go, what could that be? So I wouldn't be as well. The other red flags are if people feel sort of, especially with pain, but even without, if people feel short of breath, sort of clammy and sweaty. One of the ones we see in athletes is people coming in and they're saying, I've got this hill at the end of the street that I ride up every week, no problem. And over the last 2 weeks, I'm really short of breath when I get halfway up. It's new. It's never been like that. there's something wrong. That is a really, really good reason to go and get tested.
How often should you get checked if you're not experiencing any of these problems? You know, is it once a year, once in a blue moon? When should you go, oh, you know what, it's been a while?
I think as males and females, particularly males, because we are at higher risk of heart disease, beyond middle age, beyond the age of, depending on whether you have a family history, but let's say sort of thinking about it at 35 and certainly from 40, it's good to have a yearly check where your blood pressure and your cholesterol are checked, because they are two things. They're not perfect, but they're two indicators as to whether further tests need to be done. But as I said, in some ways, I'm not as fussed about people getting, I almost see it more important, that red flag discussion, i.e. if people have symptoms, go and see your doctor quickly, don't just ignore it. But in addition to that, having a chat to your doctor so it's in your mind, and getting your cholesterol and blood pressure checked.
All right, one of the other things that I did wear was the Holter device, which was the 24-hour device. Now, what have you got back from that? You know, there's one thing when I did the test, but what's going on with me when I'm back at home being a bit of a scallywag?
So the Holter monitor is a way that we can look at the electrical patterns. In this case, you wear the device for 24 hours, and we can see if there's extra heartbeats or any little clusters of heart rhythm disturbance. We're particularly interested in this in athletes because we know in middle-aged and older athletes that some heart rhythm problems like atrial fibrillation, which is just one of the more common erratic arrhythmias, which is a real nuisance, rather than it doesn't tend to cause, well, it not doesn't tend to, it never causes people to die suddenly. But even these problematic arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation, they're more common in athletes. So we're very interested. And that's part of the reason, as part of this research, we got you to wear the monitor. Your heart is incredibly stable. You had 40 extra beats, i.e. on top of the, whatever it is, tens of thousands of heartbeats over the day. You had 40 extra ones. And of those 40 extra ones, only 4 of them came from the ventricle. That's incredibly stable. That's about as sort of normal or reassuring as we can get. And that's what we see in the majority of people.
Someone who hasn't exercised or who's lived a normal, healthy life and hasn't been a pro athlete, you would expect to see this from them. And actually in the Holter device test, you may see differences with athletes. Now, is that what you're trying to say? That with an athlete who's been pushing himself for many years, the Holter device is going to show maybe where things are starting to come undone?
Yeah, the Holter monitor, we're starting to learn more than we realise, because there's almost two different issues. When people, during their career, when they're competing really hard, and we often see things like pauses, gaps between heartbeats that can be 2 or 3 seconds. And we never see that in the general community. When people retire, they tend to disappear. And so yours, for example, you had no pauses of 2 seconds or more. During your career, that may have been different. So there's some things that occur during a racing career and then go away. And then there's some things that tend to come on later in life, like atrial fibrillation. People will know about some young endurance athletes. We've got some Olympic athletes who have had atrial fibrillation during their career or earlier in life. But more typically, those heart rhythm problems come on in your 50s, 60s, 70s. All of your testing mean that you're put you at low likelihood of that. But it's something that could occur. And it's the one, if you like, sting in the tail, one downside of being highly fit is that the risk of atrial fibrillation in some of these arrhythmias is slightly more. Is that a reason to sort of slow down or do less? I don't think it is, because it's like, every other tick is in the good column. You'll be more functional, statistically live a bit longer, lower risk of all of these diseases, and up against that, this slight increase in a heart rhythm problem that fits more in the nuisance category than anything else.
We more or less answered my last question. Really, is what does the future really look like for me and other retired pro athletes? Are we expecting just this to slowly get less and less, or I guess that's sort of what you're indicating, is that it's just going to be a slow decline as my exercise sort of slowly decreases?
Yeah, and as age comes on, you do become physiologically and biologically a little less fit with age. Everyone would realise that. But you can't take it for granted. If you stop exercising altogether, you won't your fitness will drop away quite quickly. But if you just maintain good levels of exercise, you've set yourself up with the kind of reserve and fitness you have now. You've set yourself up for an independent life for the rest of your life. You'll still have reserve when you're 70, 80 years of age, and you'll be able to do what you want to do. And I don't think people think about just how important that is. And if there was a message for everyone out there, it's when you're in your middle age, get fit so that you're feeling better when you're 70 and 80. And it really works like that.
Well, once again, I love being in here. I've got to just keep talking about this and asking a million questions that you're probably thinking, hey, stop asking me all these hypotheticals, but they're great. I love doing the testing. As hard as it was, to be able to have this data on me up here on the computer and to be able to discuss it with you here, it's been really special. Thanks, Andre.
Absolute pleasure, Mitch.
Well, there we go. A bit of an anticlimax in a way because nothing has really changed. But what a privilege it was to be able to go in there and do all these tests and actually understand how I'm sitting, how I'm tracking, and actually just to know that everything's okay. I know you're probably sitting back there thinking, yeah, of course, you raced and, you were physically active the whole of last year, but you still got that question lingering over your head. Is it all okay in there? What are those tight pains that I feel sometimes, or is that something to worry about? That was the best thing about going in there and doing all that testing. A massive thanks goes out to Rapha, of course, who are supporting the podcast this year. I'm loving working with them again on the podcast, but of course outside the podcast on all the little events and rides that we do. Will Jones, who's piecing these episodes together this year, and always with Life from the Peloton, I'm giving him a ton of audio and he's streaming it together to make an awesome little story and a listen for you guys. Meg behind the scenes, who's doing all the nuts and bolts to make this show happen as well. And of course, you guys for listening. Last but not least, the Baker Institute, Andre Gerche and his team for putting up with me that day and running me through those tests and putting up with the little microphone that I had carrying around with me all day. It was a real privilege to be in there and to produce this podcast out of a great day undergoing these tests. Coming up, you guys, in 2 weeks, I have got the legend himself, Chris Froome. I sat down with him last week here in Melbourne and had a chat about his career. It really, really was an honour. I hope you guys enjoy that. That is coming up. So until then, cheers, guys. The music in this episode was composed by Pete Shelley. Cheers, mate.